A night guard at a shuttered mall discovers that the building's hidden sublevel is a slow, patient archive of every life that has passed through it, and that his own file has been waiting on a desk down there since the day he was hired. My name is Adrien Vasko, and for the better part of 9 years, I worked the overnight shift at Westfield Mall, which sat at the end of a frontage road in a county most people only drive through on their way to somewhere that matters more. I want to be honest about that from the beginning, because I think the kind of person who takes a job like mine is already partway through a story they don't know how to finish. You don't sit alone in a building like that, between the hours when the cleaners leave and the bakery deliveries arrive, unless something in your life has gone quiet in a way you don't know how to fix. I had a wife once. I had a small house with a yard that I never finished landscaping. I had a daughter named Iris, who used to draw them all on printer paper because she thought the fountain in the food court was the most beautiful thing in the world. By the time any of this began, I had none of those things anymore, and the mall was the only place that still expected me at a specific hour. Westfield was not the kind of mall that made the news. It had been built in 1987 on the site of an old rail yard, and you could still see the bones of that history if you knew where to look, in the way the parking lot sloped unevenly toward the east, in the strange iron rings embedded in the concrete behind the loading docks, in the long seam that ran under the carpet of the central corridor, where two foundations had been joined without quite agreeing on the same level. When I started in 2014, there were still anchor stores at both ends and a movie theater that drew weekend crowds. By the time I'm telling you about, in the autumn of my 9th year, half the storefronts were dark. The theater had been gutted, and the fountain in the food court had been drained and filled with potted plants that no one watered. The mall was dying. Everyone knew it. The owners had stopped pretending otherwise. They simply kept paying the smallest staff they could manage until the lease structure made it cheaper to demolish than to maintain. There were 3 of us on the overnight roster. Me, a man named Coralt, who had been there longer than anyone could remember, and a younger woman named Marisol, who was working her way through a community college program in radiology. We rotated through 12-hour shifts, 6 in the evening to 6 in the morning, and we almost never saw each other, except during the changeover at the loading dock office, which smelled permanently of old coffee and the cold metal of the safe we never opened. Coral was the one who trained me. He was a thin, careful man in his 60s, with a face that had settled into the kind of expression people develop when they have stopped expecting to be surprised. He taught me the patrol route in a single night, walked me through every corridor, every fire door, every service stair, and at the end of it, he said something I did not understand at the time. He said, "You'll learn the building, but try not to let the building learn you." I thought it was just an old man being colourful. I laughed. He didn't laugh back. The patrol route was simple. I would start in the security office at the south end, take the main corridor north through the lower level, check each storefront's gate, ride the escalator up at the central atrium, walk the upper level back south, descend by the freight elevator near the old anchor, and then loop through the service corridors that ran behind the stores, like the veins of something half asleep. The full circuit took about 40 minutes if you walked at the pace required by the insurance policy. There were 6 circuits in a shift. The rest of the time you sat in the office and watched the monitors. There were 48 cameras, though only 36 of them still worked. And of those, 6 produced a picture so degraded by age and bad cabling that you couldn't really see anything but ghosted shapes moving through a grey fog. Those 6 covered the lower service levels, where almost nothing ever happened, and the cost of replacing the cables had been quoted at a figure the owners would never approve. For the first 8 years, the job was exactly as boring as it sounds. I read books. I wrote letters to Iris that I never sent, because I didn't have an address to send them to. I learned the building the way a man learns a long marriage, which is to say, I learned its noises and its moods, the way the HVAC would sigh at 3 in the morning, the way the freight elevator would settle on its cables with a small metallic complaint about an hour after the last delivery, the way the rain on the skylights above the atrium sounded different from the rain on the loading dock roof. I learned which storefronts had gates that rattled when the air handlers cycled, and which ones did not. I learned that the old fountain pump, even drained and dry, would sometimes click faintly at 4 in the morning, as if something in its memory still expected to push water. None of this frightened me. It was simply the texture of the place. I should tell you a little more about Iris before I go further, because she is the wound the rest of the story presses against. And if you do not know about her, you will not understand what came later. She was 7 when she died. She had a kind of lung condition that had been managed for most of her life, and then, one winter, was not. The hospital was good to us. The doctor who told me was a woman named Acevedo, who I have never been able to think about without also thinking about the specific blue of the chairs in the family room where she found me. My wife, Renata, was already in the room when I got there. Iris had drawn the fountain at Westfield 3 days before, in a notebook she carried everywhere, and the drawing was in her backpack in the chair next to Renata, and I could see it through the half-open zipper. The fountain in the drawing had 3 tiers. The real fountain only had 2. Iris had always added a 3rd tier, because she said the fountain was too sad without it. I have thought about that 3rd tier almost every day since. Renata left me in the spring after Iris died. She did not leave in anger. She left in the way a person leaves a room they cannot stay in any longer, without becoming someone they do not want to be. We still spoke, in those early years, in a careful, distant way, like 2 people sharing custody of a memory neither of them could carry alone. I took the job at Westfield because a friend of mine knew the operations manager, and because the night shift meant I did not have to look at people in daylight. I told myself, then, that it would be temporary. I told myself that every year for 9 years. The first thing that was not part of the texture of the building happened on a Tuesday in late September, 3 weeks before everything else began. I was on my 4th circuit, walking the upper level back south, when I noticed that the gate of a store called Halverson's Books was half raised. Halverson's had closed in 2019. The gate had been pulled down and locked the night the owner handed in the keys, and I had walked past it twice a night, 6 nights a week, for almost 4 years. I had never seen it anything but closed. I stopped in front of it. The gate was raised exactly to the height of my waist. Behind it, the store was empty. Just the dim shape of bare shelving against the back wall, and the faded outline on the floor where the front display table used to sit. There was no one inside. There was no reason for the gate to be open. The lock that should have held it was still attached to the bottom of the gate, the shackle closed, the body of the lock simply hanging in the air on the wrong side of the track. as if the gate had risen through it without resistance. I stood there for a long time. I have thought about that moment a great deal since, because it was the last moment in which I could have walked away from any of this and not been changed by it. I could have lowered the gate, locked it, finished my circuit, and gone home, and never asked another question. I would like to say I almost did. The truth is that I felt something I had not felt in a long time, which was curiosity. And the curiosity was warmer than I had expected it to be. And that is what made me reach for the radio instead of for the gate. I called Coralt, because Coralt was the one you called when something didn't fit. He answered on the second ring, even though it was his night off. And he listened to my description without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. And he said, "Close it if you can, and if you can't, leave it alone, and do not go inside." I asked him what he meant by that. He said, "Adrien, just do the route, finish the shift, we'll talk in the morning." He hung up. I closed the gate. It came down easily, smoothly, as if it had been waiting for someone to ask. The lock dropped back into its proper position on the track when I lowered the gate over it, and when I tugged at it to check, it held. I finished the circuit. I sat in the office for the rest of the shift and watched the monitors and did not see anything unusual. When Marisol came in at 6, I did not mention it. I drove home and slept badly and dreamed of my daughter sitting on the lip of the empty fountain, looking down into it as if there was still water there. In the dream, the fountain had 3 tiers, and Iris was looking down into the third one, and she said, without turning around, "The third tier is where they keep the names." I woke at noon. I did not understand what she had said in the dream. I made coffee and let it go cold. I sat in the apartment for a long time before I called Coralt. He answered. He told me to meet him at a diner 3 blocks from the mall. He said, "Do not come to my apartment." I asked him why. He said, "Because if you come to my apartment, you will see what I am packing, and you will ask questions I do not want to answer in a place that has my name on the lease." We met at the diner at 1 in the afternoon. He ordered coffee and didn't drink it. He looked at me for a long time before he spoke. Then he asked me how long I had worked at Westfield. I told him. He asked me if I had ever been down to the sub-basement. I said I didn't know there was a sub-basement. He nodded as if that confirmed something he had hoped would not be confirmed. And he told me what I'm going to tell you now, though it took him almost an hour to get through it. And he stopped several times to look at the door of the diner, as if he expected someone to come through it who would make him stop. He said that Westfield Mall had been built over the rail yard, but the rail yard itself had been built over something older. He didn't know what. He had tried once to find records at the county archive, and he had found references to a quarry and references to a holding facility for prisoners being moved by rail in the 1910s, and references to a fire in 1923 that had killed an unknown number of people in a structure no one could quite identify on the surviving maps. He had found that the land had been sold 3 times in the 20 years before the mall was built, each time to a different shell company, each time at a loss, and that the final sale had included a clause requiring the buyer to maintain access to a certain set of sub-grade chambers that did not appear on any building plan he had ever seen. He said that when the mall was constructed, those chambers had been preserved beneath the foundation sealed but accessible, and that a single service stair led down to them from a door at the back of the freight elevator shaft. He said the door was locked, and the key was kept in a small safe in the security office that none of us had been told about, behind the panel where the spare radio batteries were stored. He said he had been down there once in 1998, when he was a much younger man, and that he had never gone down again, and that he hoped I never would either. I asked him what he had seen. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't see anything, Adrien. I heard things. I heard my mother's voice, and she had been dead for 6 years. I heard a child crying, who I think was me, when I was very small, in a house I had not thought about in 40 years. I heard a man I worked with in the army, who had died in a way I do not talk about. I heard them all at once, layered, like a recording that had been folded over itself. And I heard one more thing. I heard my own voice, older than I was then, telling me to leave." He paused. He said, "The voice that told me to leave sounded exactly like I sound now. I have spent 25 years wondering whether I have already been down there, at the end of my life, telling my younger self to go back upstairs. I have spent 25 years not going back, because I'm afraid that if I go down there now, I will recognize what I heard. I want to be honest. I did not believe him. I believed that he believed it, which is a different thing. I believed that something had happened to him down there, and that his mind had made sense of it in the way minds do, by giving the experience a shape it could remember. I thanked him for telling me. I asked him what he had meant about packing. He said he had given his notice. He said he was leaving the state. He said he had been planning it for almost a year, and had only stayed long enough to make sure that the next person who walked into that office would not walk into it alone. I asked him why he was telling me this now and not earlier. He said, "Because the building has started showing you things, and once it starts showing you things, you are no longer a stranger to it, and it will not stop until you have answered the question it is asking." I asked him what the question was. He said, "You will know it when you see it. And when you do, I hope you remember that the only answer that lets you out is the answer that does not require you to finish." I did not understand him. I asked him to explain. He shook his head. He said, "Adrien, you cannot be told. You can only be warned. I have warned you. That is the most I can do." He paid for both coffees. He stood up. He put his hand on my shoulder, briefly, and he said, "A combination is in your name. A combination has always been in your name. When you are ready, you will know." He walked out of the diner. I did not see him again. I drove home. I went to work that evening, and I did the route. And the gate of Halverson's Books was closed and locked exactly the way it had always been. And I told myself that whatever had happened the night before had been a trick of fatigue and dim light. I told myself this for almost a week. On the 8th night, I found the second anomaly. I was at the south end of the lower level, near the entrance to what had been a children's clothing store called Little Mercer's. Little Mercer's had been closed for almost 3 years. Its windows had been papered over with a generic "for lease" sign in the way the management company did with all the long-term vacancies. As I walked past, I noticed that one of the papered windows had a fingerprint on it, on the inside of the glass. A single fingerprint, at about the height of a child's hand, pressed against the paper. as if someone had put their palm flat to the inside of the window, and only the index finger had touched the glass. The paper was old, faded, curled at the edges. The fingerprint was clean and dark, as if it had been left in something wet. I stood in front of the window for what must have been 5 minutes. I did not breathe for most of that time. The fingerprint was at the exact height that Iris's hand had been when she was 6. I knew this because I had measured her against a door frame in our old kitchen many times, and the height of the print was at a height I had not measured against in many years, but which my body remembered the way a body remembers any small physical thing it has done many times. The shape of the print was wrong for an adult finger. It was the shape of a child's fingertip, narrow at the top, soft and round, pressed gently to the glass. I went into the office and pulled the camera feed for that corridor. I rewound it through the entire shift, watching the empty floor in front of Little Mercer's at 16 times speed. Nothing crossed in front of the store except me, on my circuits, and an occasional moth caught in the recessed lighting. I rewound it through the previous shift, and the shift before that, and I went back almost a full week before my eyes gave out, and I had to stop. No one had been near that window. The paper was undisturbed on the other side. The fingerprint was on the inside, on a window that had been sealed for 3 years. I did not call Coral this time. I am not proud of that. I want to tell you that I was being brave, but I was not. I was being something else, something closer to the feeling a man has when he begins to suspect that a story he has been told is true. And he does not want to know yet, because once he knows, he will have to decide what to do about it. I finished the shift. I went home. I came back the next night. The fingerprint was gone. The paper was undisturbed. I stood in front of the window and felt nothing at all, which somehow was worse than what I had felt the night before. This is when the pattern began, though I did not recognize it as a pattern at first. Over the following 2 weeks, I found 7 more anomalies, and each of them was small enough that any one of them alone could be explained away. I want to walk you through them carefully, because I think the smallness of them mattered, and I think the way they accumulated mattered, and I think any one of them, taken on its own, would have been the kind of thing I would have laughed off in another life. The first of the 7 was a pair of children's shoes, left neatly on the bench outside the empty pet store, gone an hour later. They were small white sneakers with Velcro straps, scuffed at the toes, sized for a child of about 5 or 6. The laces of one had been tied and then untied and retied in a way I recognized immediately, because it was the way I had taught Iris to tie hers in the year before she learned to do it the standard way. The way the shoelaces formed 2 loops first and then crossed over instead of looping around. I sat on the bench beside them for almost 10 minutes. I do not know why I did not pick them up. I think I was afraid that if I picked them up, they would be warm, or they would not be warm, and either answer would have undone me. When I came back on the next circuit, the shoes were gone. There was no trace of them. I checked the camera. The bench was empty for the entire shift. I had never been on the bench. The second was a receipt from a store that had closed in 2016, lying face up in the middle of the corridor, printed with that day's date. The store was a candy shop called Sweet Hollow, which Iris had loved. The receipt was for a single bag of malted milk eggs, which had been her favorite candy in the spring before she died. The receipt was printed in clear black ink on the kind of thermal paper that fades after a few months, and the paper looked new, and the date was the date I was working. I took the receipt back to the office and put it in a drawer. The next morning, when I checked the drawer, the receipt was still there. I have it still. The paper has not faded. The third was a woman's perfume, strong and floral, in the air outside a bridal shop that had been gutted to the walls. The perfume was the brand my mother had worn for the last 20 years of her life, and which I had not smelled since her funeral. My mother had not been a woman Iris had known well. She had died when Iris was very young. I stood outside the bridal shop, and I cried in a way I had not cried for my mother in a long time. The perfume faded after a few minutes. The bridal shop was empty behind the glass. I walked past it 3 more times that night and smelled nothing. The fourth was a song I half remembered playing once, very faintly, from the speakers above the food court, when the speakers had been disconnected from their amplifier for over a year, a fact I confirmed by climbing onto a chair and looking. The song was a lullaby my wife's mother had sung to Iris when Iris was a baby. I had only heard it 3 or 4 times in my life, and I had not been able to remember the melody since Iris's death, though I had tried, on several long drives, to bring it back. When I heard it that night, I recognized it immediately, and I understood for the first time that I had not been unable to remember it. I had been refusing to. The song played for about 90 seconds and then stopped. The speakers were still disconnected. The wires were still hanging loose where I had seen them an hour earlier. The fifth was the sound of a coin dropping into a fountain that had been dry for 3 years. I was on the upper level, leaning against the railing that overlooked the food court, when I heard it. The small, perfect, metallic ringing of a coin striking the inside of a basin, and rolling for a moment before settling. I looked down. The fountain was dark and empty, the potted plants slumped in their containers, the basin grey with old dust. There was no coin in it. There was no one near it. The sound did not repeat. The sixth was a handprint, adult this time, on the brushed metal of the freight elevator door, smudged as if someone had leaned against it with their full weight, and which wiped away easily with my sleeve, and which was back 2 nights later in the same place. The handprint was the size of my own hand. The position of the fingers was the position my hand fell in naturally when I leaned against a door. The thumbprint at the edge of the smudge had a small scar across the middle joint, which I have, from a kitchen knife I dropped in 2009. I wiped the handprint away. I checked my own thumb. The scar was there. The handprint, when it came back, had the same scar. The seventh was the smell I knew, and which I did not want to know. The smell of the lotion my wife had used in the year before she left, a brand that had been discontinued by then for at least 5 years. It was in the corridor outside the old anchor store. I want to tell you what it did to me, because I think it matters. I had not thought about that lotion in a long time. I had trained myself not to think about it. The way you train yourself not to step on a particular floorboard in a house where someone has died. When I smelled it in that corridor at 3 in the morning, with the lights dim and the building empty, I felt something inside me give way. I sat down on a bench across from the closed anchor, and I put my head in my hands, and I cried in a way I had not cried since the year my marriage ended. I cried for a long time. When I looked up, the smell was gone, and the corridor was just a corridor. And I had the strong and unreasonable sense that something had been watching me from behind the dark glass of the anchor store, and that it had not been cruel, and that this was somehow worse than if it had been. I want to say something here about what I started to understand during those 2 weeks, though I did not have the language for it yet. I understood that the things I was finding were not random. They were not the standard inventory of a haunted building. They were specific to me. They were the small, private artifacts of a life I had spent 9 years trying not to look at directly. The shoes, the receipt, the perfume, the lullaby, the coin, the handprint, the lotion. Each of these was a piece of me that I had buried. Each of these was being placed in front of me, gently, like someone setting objects on a table for me to identify. I began to feel, in the days between shifts, that I was being interviewed. I began to feel that the building was asking me to confirm that these things had been mine. I began to feel, more uncomfortably, that I was not being interviewed for the first time, that something about the process felt practiced, almost gentle, as if whatever was doing this had done it many times, with many other people, and had developed a method. It was on the night after the lotion that I went back to the office and walked over to the panel where the spare radio batteries were stored. I pulled the panel away from the wall, and behind it, exactly as Coralt had described, there was a small steel safe set into the cinder block with a combination dial and a label that had once said something I could no longer read. I did not know the combination. I sat in front of the safe for almost an hour. I tried birthdays. I tried the year the mall opened. I tried zeros. None of them worked. I tried, finally, the date of Iris's birth, because Coral had said the combination was in my name, and because I did not know what else my name meant in this place. The dial caught. The lock clicked. The door of the safe swung open. I want to stop here for a moment and tell you what I felt, because I want to be honest. I felt afraid, but not in the way I expected. I felt afraid the way you feel when a doctor calls you back into the office to discuss results. I felt the kind of fear that arrives with a certainty that something has already happened, and now you are only going to be told about it. I did not feel hunted. I felt accounted for. I think there is a difference, though I'm not sure I can explain it any more clearly than that. The safe knew her birthday. Someone had set the combination decades ago to the birthday of a child I had not yet had at the time. Someone had been waiting for me, and for her, before either of us existed. Inside the safe were 3 things. A single brass key on a leather fob, worn smooth by handling. A logbook bound in black canvas, the kind of ledger you used to find in old hardware stores. And a stack of photographs, perhaps 30 in total, held together with a rubber band that had hardened with age and broke when I touched it. I sat down at the desk. I opened the logbook first. The first entry was dated March of 1989, almost 2 years after the mall opened, and it was written in a handwriting I did not know. It said, descended at 0240, returned at 0317, no incident, recommend continued sealing of access point. The second entry was dated 4 months later, in a different hand. It said, descended at 0150, returned at 0214, heard voices but did not respond, Recommend continued sealing. The third entry was longer, and it said, descended at 03:30, encountered the smell of my father's pipe, who died in 1962. Did not proceed past the second landing. Recommend continued sealing. Recommend rotation of the night staff to prevent prolonged exposure. The entries continued in different hands, sometimes years apart, sometimes only weeks. There were perhaps 60 of them in total, and they covered 34 years of the mall's existence, and almost every one of them included a sensory experience that the writer recognized from their own past, and almost every one of them ended with the same phrase: recommend continued sealing. I read them slowly. I read them all the way through. I noticed something as I read. The writers of the entries did not refer to the chamber below as a chamber. They referred to it as the room. They referred to the writer of what they had found there as the keeper, though no one ever defined what the keeper was or what it was keeping. I noticed that the entries from the 1990s were short and clipped. The entries from the 2000s were longer and more frightened, and the entries from the 2010s were almost philosophical, as if the writers had had more time to think between visits and had used that time to try to understand. I noticed that several of the entries were signed with only initials, and that some of those initials matched names I knew from the building. There had been a janitor in my first year named Erlin, who had retired in 2018, and an entry from 2007 was signed with his initials. There had been an operations manager named Petrosky in the mid-1990s, whose name I knew from old maintenance tags on the equipment, and an entry from 1996 was signed with his initials. The chamber, whatever it was, had been visited by many people over many years, and each visit had been recorded, and each visitor had walked back upstairs and continued their lives without telling the rest of us. The handwriting I recognized appeared first in 1998. It was Coral's. His entry said, descended at 02:40, heard the voices of 3 people known to me, did not proceed past the second landing, recommend continued sealing, recommend that the next entry be made only when the building has accepted a new long-term staff member, as I do not believe I can do this again. The next entry, in someone else's hand, was 4 years later, and it referred to Coralt in the third person, as if he had passed the responsibility on and walked away from it. Earlier, it was in a hand I did not recognize. It said, descended at 04:10, did not proceed past the first landing, sensed presence of new candidate above, recommend continued sealing until the candidate is ready. I did not know who had written this. I did not know who the candidate was. I read the entry 3 times. The third time, I understood that the candidate was me. I turned to the photographs. They were not what I expected. They were not images of the sub-basement or of anything dramatic. They were portraits mostly, taken in the style of those old ID photographs they used to print on stiff paper, with the subject seated in front of a plain wall, looking directly at the camera. There were perhaps 30 of them, as I said. Each was labelled on the back with a name and a date. The dates ranged from 1924 to 2011. The names meant nothing to me. The faces meant nothing to me either at first. I went through them slowly, one by one, and I felt a vague unease that I could not place. A sense that I was looking at people I should know, though I knew I did not know them. The second to last photograph was a man in his late 50s, grey-haired, with an expression that I can only describe as tired in a way that goes beyond sleep. The label on the back said, Coralt M, 2014. The year I had started at the mall. The last photograph was me. I knew it was me before I turned it over. I was perhaps 10 years older in the photograph than I was now. My hair greyer, my face thinner, my eyes set into the same exhausted expression I had just seen in Coralt's image. I was sitting in front of the same plain wall, and I was wearing a shirt I did not own, and the lighting was wrong for any photograph I had ever taken. The label on the back said, Vasko A, 2014. The year I had started at the mall, 9 years before I held the photograph in my hands. I sat in the office for a long time. I did not finish the shift. I did not do the rest of the circuits. I sat at the desk and I looked at the photograph and I tried to understand what I was looking at. And I could not. At some point, near the end of the night, I became aware of the sound of the freight elevator settling on its cables. The small metallic complaint I had heard 1,000 times before. But this time, the elevator had not moved all night. There had been no delivery. The complaint came from the elevator anyway, as if it were settling under a weight that had only just been placed inside it. I went to the monitors and I looked at the elevator camera. The elevator was empty. The doors were closed. The complaint came again, soft and metallic. Exactly the sound a freight elevator makes when something heavy steps off it. I did not go to the elevator. I sat back down at the desk. I put the photograph face down. I waited until 6 in the morning. I gave Marisol the keys at the loading dock, and I told her, very carefully, that the lower service levels should not be patrolled tonight, and that if she heard anything from the freight elevator, she should ignore it. She looked at me strangely. She asked if I was all right. I told her I was tired. I drove home. I did not go back the next night. Sick. I called in sick for 3 nights in a row, which was the longest stretch I had taken off in 9 years. I sat in my apartment and I looked at the photograph and I tried to remember if I had ever sat for a portrait like that at any time in my life. And I could not. The photograph had been in the safe since 2014. It had been waiting there for me for 9 years. Someone had taken it before I started the job. Someone had labelled it with my name and the year of my hiring. Someone had placed it beneath the photograph of Horror, who had been at the mall longer than anyone could remember, and whose own photograph was labelled with the same year, the year I started, even though he had been there for decades by then. I tried during those 3 days to think about it logically. I made lists. I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow pad and I wrote down everything I knew about the building and everything I knew about myself in 2 columns. And I tried to find the places where the columns touched. The mall had been built in 1987. I had been born in 1979. I had been a child when the mall was new. I had even visited it once on a road trip with my parents in the summer of 1989 when I was 10 years old. We had eaten lunch in the food court. I remembered the fountain. The fountain had been new then. I had thrown a coin into it. My mother had let me make a wish, and I had wished, with the seriousness particular to 10-year-olds, that I would someday have a daughter. I had not thought about that wish in 35 years. I had not thought about that visit since the day I started working there. I had walked past the fountain 8 times a night for 9 years and had not, somehow, ever connected it to the fountain I had thrown a coin into as a child. The mall had been part of my life since I was 10, and I had forgotten, and the building had not. I want to say that this realization is the moment I decided to go down. I want to say it was a moment of clarity, or of resolve, or of any of the things people credit themselves with in retrospect. The truth is that it was a moment of recognition, and the recognition was not in me, but in the building. And I felt, sitting at my kitchen table with the yellow pad in front of me, that I had been recognized by the place I worked, in a way that no person had recognized me for, as long as I could remember. I felt seen, in the smallest and most uncomfortable sense of the word. I felt that the building had known about Iris before I had. I felt that the building had known about the wish, and the coin, and the third tier of the drawing she had made in her notebook 3 days before she died. I felt that I could no longer afford to not know what the building knew about me, because the not knowing had become a kind of cowardice. And I had been a coward for 9 years, and I was tired of it. On the 4th night, I went back. I had decided something, though I'm not sure I could have explained the decision at the time. I think what I had decided was that I needed to see for myself. I think I had decided that I could not spend the rest of my life knowing what I now knew, and not knowing what was underneath the knowing. I think I had also decided, in some part of myself that I was not yet listening to, that the photograph was not a threat, but a confirmation, and that I had been moving toward the sub-basement for a long time without realizing it, and that whatever was down there was no longer optional. I drove to work. I clocked in. I did the first circuit. Everything was normal. I returned to the office. I took the brass key from the safe. I walked to the back of the freight elevator shaft. The door was there. It was exactly where Coralt had said it would be. It was a steel door, painted the same dull grey as the wall behind it, with no handle on the outside, only a keyhole. It had been painted over so many times that the seams had nearly disappeared. If I had not been looking for it, I would have walked past it forever, as I had walked past it every night for 9 years. The key fit. The lock turned with a small dry click, as if the mechanism had been kept oiled by hands I had never seen. The door opened toward me. Behind it was a stairwell. The stairwell was narrow, with concrete walls and a metal railing that had been painted the same dull grey, and a single bare bulb hanging from a cord at the first landing. The bulb was on. The air that came up from the stairwell was cool and dry and clean, and it smelled faintly of stone, the way a basement in an old house smells when no one has lived there for a long time. There was no sound from below. I stood at the top of the stairs for a long time. Then I stepped through the doorway, and I started down. The first landing was 12 steps down. The second was another 12, and the bulb on the second landing was off. But the bulb on the third was on, and I could see well enough to keep going. I counted the landings as I descended. 5, 6, 7. The air grew slightly cooler, but no damper. There was no echo. My footsteps fell flat against the concrete and did not return to me, as if the stairwell were absorbing sound at exactly the rate I was producing it, holding it in some careful balance. At the 8th landing, I stopped, because I could hear something, faintly, from below. It was not a voice. It was the sound of paper being turned, slowly, page by page, as if someone were reading in a quiet room. I went down to the 9th landing, and then the 10th, and the sound grew clearer. And at the 11th landing, the stairwell ended in a small foyer with a steel door at the far end. This door also had no handle, only a keyhole, and the brass key fitted, and the lock turned, and the door opened into the chamber that I had been told about and had not believed in, and which I have spent every day since trying to understand. The chamber was large. I could not see its full extent from the doorway, because the lighting was low and uneven. The same bare bulbs hanging at intervals from the ceiling, casting circles of yellow light that did not quite touch each other. The floor was concrete, smooth, swept clean. The walls were lined, from floor to ceiling, with wooden shelving, the kind you find in old libraries, with vertical dividers spaced at regular intervals, and within each division, stacks of paper folders, neatly arranged, their spines facing outward. There were hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. The shelving extended down the length of the chamber and turned at the end, and continued along another wall, and another, and another, and the chamber was deeper than I had expected, and the shelving was full. The air in the chamber was different from the air in the stairwell. It had a quality I have struggled to name in the months since, and the best I can do is to say that it had the quality of a room in which someone is reading. There is a particular stillness that gathers around a person who is reading, a slowing of the room around them, a careful suspension of small noises. The chamber had that stillness, magnified, as if it had been gathering that stillness for a long time, as if the reading that was going on inside it had been going on for longer than I could measure. I walked slowly down the central aisle. The folders were labelled on small white tabs glued to their spines, with names and dates. The dates went back further than I had expected. The earliest I saw was 1847, and the folder was thin and brown, and looked as if it would crumble if I touched it. The most recent dates were from the previous month. I read names at random as I walked. Most of them meant nothing to me. A few of them were vaguely familiar in the way names sometimes are, as if I had heard them in passing, on a news broadcast, in a conversation overheard at a gas station. I kept walking. The chamber went on. The shelving went on. The folders went on. I noticed something as I walked. The shelves were not arranged by date, or by alphabet, or by any system I could identify. A folder from 1923 sat beside a folder from 1987. A folder from 2004 sat beside a folder from 1862. I did not understand the principle of the arrangement. I would not understand it until later, when I had had time to think. Halfway down the central aisle, I stopped, because I had seen a name I knew. The label said, Vasko E., 1989. The folder was thin, almost empty, and the date was the year of my visit to the mall as a child, the year I had thrown the coin into the fountain. The name was not mine. My initial was A. The folder belonged to my mother. Her name had been Eleanor. Her file had been opened in 1989, in this building, on the day she had brought me here on a road trip. I stared at the folder. I did not take it down. I did not open it. I felt that opening it would be a kind of trespass that I was not entitled to. I felt that my mother, wherever she was now, had not given me permission to know what she had been thinking on that day, what she had wished for, what the building had recorded about her in the years before her death. A few feet further on, there was another folder. Vasko R. 1989. R for Renata. My wife. She had not been my wife then. She had been a teenager I had not yet met, in a different state, 3 states away, who would not enter my life for another 12 years. Her folder had been opened on the same day my mother's had. I did not know why. I did not understand how a building could open a file on a person who had not been in the building, who had had no connection to it, who would not have any connection to it for over a decade. I stared at the folder for a long time. Then I kept walking, because I was afraid that if I stayed too long in front of it, I would understand something I did not want to understand. At the far end of the chamber, against the back wall, there was a small wooden desk with a lamp and a chair. And on the desk, a single folder was open. I approached it slowly. The folder was labelled in the same neat hand as all the others, with my name and the year 2014. The lamp was on. The chair was empty. The folder was open to the first page. The pages were thicker than I had expected. The folder was about an inch thick, maybe more. I sat down at the desk because my legs were beginning to fail me, and I began to read. The first page was a description of my life, up to and including the moment I had been hired at Westfield. It was written in a flat, descriptive style, like an entry in a personnel file. It listed my date of birth, my parents' names, the town I had grown up in, the schools I had attended. It listed the year I had married Renata, the year Iris had been born, the year my marriage had ended. It listed the date of Iris's death, which I do not say aloud anymore, but which the page in front of me knew, and which the page in front of me had recorded in the same flat hand as every other detail of my life. The date was correct. The page knew the time of day. The page knew the name of the hospital. The page knew the name of Dr. Azevedo. The page knew the name of the song that had been playing on the radio in the car when Renata had called me to tell me to come, because she could not bear to be the one who said the words. The song was a song by a band Iris had never heard, that I'd been listening to absently, that I had not thought about since. The page knew its name. The page even noted, in a small parenthetical, that I had not turned the radio off when I parked at the hospital, that the song had still been playing when I had returned to the car 6 hours later, that the battery had been dead when I tried to start it, and that I had not noticed. The second page described my hiring at Westfield Mall in 2014. It described the interview, which had been conducted by a man whose name I had forgotten. It described what I had been wearing. It described what I had been thinking, which was that I needed this job because I had stopped being able to imagine going home to an apartment in silence after working a daytime job in an office full of people who knew what had happened to me and did not know how to speak to me. The page knew this. The page knew the thoughts I had not spoken aloud. The page even noted, with a kind of dry compassion that surprised me, that I had not told the interviewer about Iris, that I had decided in the parking lot before I went in that I would not, that this had been the first time since her death that I had successfully had a conversation with another person without her name appearing in it, and that I had walked out of the interview feeling, for the first time in many months, like a man who might be able to keep being a man. The third page was dated 2014 as well, but described events that had not yet happened to me at the time of my hiring. It described the first 8 years of my work at the mall. It described the books I would read in the office. It described the letters I would write to Iris that I would not send. It described the routes I would walk, the patterns I would notice, the small comforts I would find in the building's habits. It described the night I would find the gate of Halverson's books half raised, and the night I would smell my wife's lotion outside the Anchor, and the night I would open the safe and find the photograph of myself, and the night I would walk down the stairwell and sit at the desk where I was now sitting, reading the page that described me sitting there. I stopped reading. I closed the folder. I sat for a long time with my hand on the cover. I want to tell you what I felt, because I think it is important. I did not feel afraid. I felt seen. I felt seen in the way no one had ever seen me in my life. I felt that something had been paying attention to me for longer than I had been alive, with a patience and a thoroughness that did not belong to anything human, and that this attention was not love, and was not hate, and was not interest, and was not curiosity, but something else, something I did not have a word for, and which I will spend the rest of my life trying to name. I felt grief too. I felt grief for the version of myself that had walked into the chamber, the version who had still believed, on some level, that his life was his own. I opened the folder again. I turned the page. The next page was dated 3 years from now. It described a series of events that had not happened yet. It described a phone call I would receive from Renata. It described a journey I would make to a town I had never been to. It described an encounter with a person I did not yet know, but whose name was on the page, and whose face, I realized when I read the description, was the face of a woman I had passed once in the food court 2 months earlier. A stranger who had smiled at me in a way that I had not been able to forget. The page knew. The page knew what I had not told anyone, that I had thought about her since, that I had wondered who she was, that I had felt, for the first time in many years, the small, uncomfortable warmth of being noticed by someone who was not looking at me out of pity. The page described our first conversation. It described what I would say. It described what she would say. It described the joke she would make about the coffee, which had not yet been said, but which I knew, when I read the description, was exactly the kind of joke she would make, exactly the kind of joke that would cause me to look at her too long, exactly the kind of joke that would change the course of an afternoon. I turned the page again. The next page was dated 5 years from now. It described a quiet life, in a small house, with a yard, with a garden, with a woman beside me, who was the woman from the food court, with letters I would not need to write to my daughter, because I would have begun to be able to remember her without falling apart. It described a peace I had not believed I would ever have. It described a Sunday morning in October, when I would sit on a porch and drink coffee, and watch a neighbor's dog run across a lawn and feel, for the first time in many years, that I was a man who belonged to his own life. It described the color of the dog. It described the color of the porch. It described, with the small, unfeeling precision of the rest of the file, the temperature of the coffee, and the thought I would have at that moment, which was that I had not deserved this, but had been given it anyway. and that the only honest response to being given something one had not deserved was to use it well. I turned the page again. The next page was dated 7 years from now. It described an illness. It described a hospital. It described the same flat, descriptive style being used to describe the slow loss of my body, the gradual narrowing of my attention to the room I was in, the woman beside the bed, the moment of my death, the time of day, the name of the doctor. The page knew. The page already knew. I stopped turning the pages. I sat at the desk. I closed the folder. I put my hands flat on the cover. I sat that way for a long time. I do not know how long. At some point, I became aware that I was no longer alone in the chamber. I did not hear footsteps. I did not see movement. I simply knew that something was standing at the far end of the central aisle, behind me, where I had entered. I did not turn around. I did not need to. I knew what it was, though I could not have told you how I knew. It was not a person. It was not a creature. It was the thing that had written the folder. It was the thing that had been writing all the folders. For all the years. For all the names. It was patient. It was old. It was not malevolent. And it was not kind. And it was not interested in me, except in the way an archivist is interested in a document. It was waiting to see what I would do. I want to describe what it felt like to be in the chamber with that presence behind me, because I do not think I will ever experience anything else like it, and because I think the texture of the experience is the part of it that has stayed with me most. It did not feel like being watched. It felt like being read. It felt the way a page feels when a careful reader is studying it. I do not know how I knew what a page feels like, but I knew. I felt the small attention of something passing over me, slowly, from my edge to my edge, taking in every line of me, every detail of me, with the unhurried patience of a thing that has all the time in the world. I felt that I had been being read this way for a long time. I felt that the reading would continue whether or not I was aware of it. I felt that my only choice in that moment was whether to read along with it by opening the folder again, or whether to stand up and walk away and leave the reading to its work. I sat very still. I thought for a long time about what I had read. I thought about the woman in a food court. I thought about the small house with the yard. I thought about the Sunday morning in October. I thought about the hospital bed. I thought about Iris and the things I had not been able to say to her before she died, and the things I had said too late, and the way I had spent 9 years trying not to remember any of it. I thought about Corald, who had stood at the second landing and turned around and spent 25 years trying not to come back. I thought about all the names on all the folders, all the people whose lives had been written down before they were lived, all the witnesses who had stood at the edge of this chamber and made their decisions, one way or the other. I thought about my mother's folder, halfway down the aisle, opened in 1989, the day she had brought me here as a child. I thought about Renata's folder, opened the same day, when she had been a teenager 3 states away. I thought about Iris. I had not seen her folder. I had not looked. I had been afraid, and I had walked past, and I had told myself that I would come back to it. I am glad now that I did not. I am glad I do not know what was on the page that described her last morning. I am glad I do not know what the building had recorded about a child who had not lived long enough to know it was being watched. I have thought since that not opening her folder is one of the few acts of love I have managed in my life. I have tried to count it as one. I thought about what it meant, that a life could be written down before it was lived. I'm not sure I have understood it yet. I am not sure I will ever understand it. What I understood at the time, sitting at the desk with my hands on the folder, was something smaller and more practical. I understood that I had two choices. I could open the folder again and continue reading, all the way to the end, every page, every year, every detail of every day I had not yet lived. Or I could close the folder and stand up and walk out of the chamber and climb the stairs and lock the door and put the brass key back in the safe and live the rest of my life without knowing what was on the pages. I want to tell you that I made the brave choice. I want to tell you that I closed the folder and walked away and chose to live my life as a mystery to myself, the way a life is meant to be lived. I want to tell you that, but I cannot, because that is not what I did. Not exactly. And I have promised to be honest with you. What I did was this. I opened the folder one more time. I turned to the last page. The last page was dated in the same flat hand with a date I will not tell you, because it is mine, and I do not want you to know it. And I do not want to know whether you would treat me differently if you did. I read the last page. It was short. It described the end of my life, very briefly, in the way a personnel file might note a date of departure. It described the room I would be in. It described the people who would be there. It described the last thing I would see, which was a particular pattern of light on a ceiling in a particular hour of a particular afternoon. It described the last thing I would think, which was a memory of Iris, in a moment I had forgotten, on a day I had not realized was important, until I read about it on the page. The memory was this. Iris had been 4. We had been in the kitchen of the house I no longer owned. She'd been standing on a chair, helping me wash dishes. She'd been wearing a yellow shirt with a small stain on the collar that Renata had not been able to get out. She had said, without preamble, "Dad, when you die, I want you to know that I will be the one who was there first, and I will know how to find you." I had laughed. I had said, "Where did you hear that?" She'd said, "I didn't hear it. I just know it, the way you know it about your hands." I had not thought about that moment in years. I had buried it, along with every other small moment that hurt to remember. The page in front of me had brought it back. The page told me, in its flat archivist's voice, that this was the last thing I would think before I died, that I would think of her, that I would believe her, that I would believe she had been the one who was there first, and that she would know how to find me. I closed the folder. I stood up. I walked back down the central aisle. The thing that had been standing at the far end was no longer there. Or perhaps it had never been there in the way I had thought. Or perhaps it had moved aside to let me pass. Or perhaps it had simply finished what it had needed to do, which was to wait for me to make my decision. Whatever my decision had been. I climbed the stairs. I locked the door. I put the key back in the safe. I closed the safe. I replaced the panel. I sat in the office for the rest of the shift, and I did not do the remaining circuits. And when Marisol arrived at 6 in the morning, I told her that I was resigning, effective immediately, and that I would not be coming back, and that she should not, under any circumstances, accept any key that Coral or anyone else had given her, and that if she found a safe behind the panel with the spare radio batteries, she should leave it alone. She looked at me strangely. She asked if I was all right. I told her I was, which was true, though not in the way she meant. I drove home. I slept. I dreamed of nothing, for the first time in many years. That was 4 months ago. I have not gone back to the mall. I have heard from a former colleague that the building is scheduled for demolition next spring. I have wondered, sometimes, what will happen to the chamber when the building above it comes down. I suspect the answer is nothing. I suspect the chamber was there before the rail yard, and before the quarry, and before the holding facility, and before the fire in 1923, and that the building above it is only the most recent of many buildings that have been raised and lowered over the same patient point in the earth, and that when the mall is gone, something else will be built, and the chamber will accept new folders, and the cycle will continue, as it continues for longer than any of us can imagine. I think about the folder every day. I think about the pages I read and the pages I did not. I have tried, in the months since, to do the things the pages said I would do, and also to refuse to do them, as a kind of test. And the results have been mixed in a way I can't quite pass. I made the phone call I was supposed to make. I went to the town I had not been to. I met the woman from the food court in a coffee shop by what felt like coincidence, and she made the joke about the coffee exactly as the page had described, and I laughed in the way the page had described me laughing. And we talked for 2 hours, and she is kind, and she is funny, and she has a sadness in her that I recognize, and I have not yet told her about any of this, and I do not know if I ever will. I have begun to imagine a small house with a yard. I have begun, very slowly, to remember Iris without falling apart. I have also begun, in moments I do not control, to feel watched. I feel it in supermarkets, in parking lots, in the corner of my own apartment when the lights are low. I feel that something is keeping track of me. I feel that the folder is still being even now, even as I tell you this, that a hand I will never see is writing down the words I am saying in a chamber beneath a building that will soon be gone, and that the writing will continue after the building is gone, and after I am gone, and that this is what it means to be in the archive, that you do not leave it even when you walk out, that you only learn slowly to live with the knowledge that everything you do is also being recorded somewhere underneath your feet. I want to tell you the rest because I think you deserve to know what I have come to understand, and I have not told anyone else. There are things I noticed in the chamber that I have only thought about since, and which have begun to matter to me in ways I could not have predicted that night. The first is this. The folders were not arranged by name, or by date, or by any system I could identify. They were arranged in a pattern that, at the time, looked random, but which I have come to suspect was not random at all. I have begun to think that the folders were arranged by some other organizing principle, something to do with how the lives inside them touched each other, how they intersected, how they shaped each other's outcomes. I have begun to think that the folder of a man I would meet, or a woman I would marry, or a child I would lose, would be placed near my own, and that the entire chamber was a kind of map of human connection, of the threads that ran between us, of the way our lives were not separate things but parts of a single woven shape. I have begun to think this because of something I noticed and did not register at the time. The folder immediately to the right of mine on the desk, which I had not opened, had been labelled with a name I did not then recognize. The name was Marisol's last name. I had never asked her for her last name in 9 years of changeovers at the loading dock. I had never thought to. I had not known it until I saw it on the folder. I have looked it up since because I was curious, and the name matches. The folder of the young woman I had been giving the keys to every morning at 6 for the last 3 years was placed beside my own in the archive because something in the chamber knew that our lives were connected in a way I had not yet understood. I called Marisol 2 weeks after I quit. I did not tell her what I had found. I asked her if she would meet me for coffee. She agreed. We sat in a small place near her college, and I asked her about her life. I asked her about her family. I asked her, eventually, very carefully, whether she had ever been to Westfield Mall before she started working there. She laughed. She said, of course, my mother used to bring me when I was a kid. We lived in the next town over. We came every Saturday for a while. I asked her if she remembered the fountain. She said, the one in the food court? Yes. I used to throw pennies in it. I asked her what year that would have been. She thought about it. She said probably 1989, 1990, somewhere in there. I would have been 4 or 5. I sat very still. I asked her what she had wished for. She looked at me strangely. She said, I don't remember. I think I wished for a sister. I never got one. Why are you asking? I did not answer. I made an excuse. I drove home. I sat in my apartment for a long time. Marisol had been at the mall in 1989. She had been 4 years old. I had been 10. We had not met. We had not seen each other. We had thrown coins into the same fountain in the same year. And the chamber had opened a folder for both of us and had placed our folders side by side on a desk and had waited 35 years for us to find each other across a loading dock door at 6 in the morning. The chamber was not just recording. The chamber was arranging. I do not know what to do with this. I do not know what it means that the building had been arranging things, gently, patiently, for as long as it has existed. I do not know whether what I am living now, the woman from the food court, the small house with the yard, the slow return to being able to remember Iris, is mine, or whether it is something the chamber wanted and arranged and is now watching unfold. I do not know whether there is a difference. I have asked myself in the long night since whether it matters that a thing was given to me by something inhuman if the thing itself is good. I have not been able to answer. The second is this. As I walked down the central aisle, I had passed a section where the folders were thinner than the others, and the labels on them were dated within the last few decades, and the names on them were unfamiliar to me, except for 1 or 2. I had not stopped to look at them at the time. I have thought about them since. I have come to suspect, though I have no way to prove it, that those folders belonged to the people who had worked at the mall over the years. The cleaners and the cashiers and the stockroom clerks and the security guards, and that every one of us, Every person who had spent any significant time inside the building had been added to the archive at the moment of our hiring, and that the folders had been written for us in advance, and that this was the price of being allowed to spend time inside a building that sat over a place like that the building was not, in fact, the point. The building was a structure for gathering people whose lives could be observed and recorded and filed. The mall was an instrument. The dying mall, the half-empty mall. The mall with its drained fountain and its closed anchors and its skeleton staff was perhaps a better instrument than the thriving mall had been, because it gathered a particular kind of person, the kind of person who would take a job in a building like this, the kind of person whose life had already begun to quiet, the kind of person whose folder would be interesting to read. The third is this. The thing I had felt standing at the far end of the central aisle, the thing that I had known without seeing, was not the writer of the folders. I am almost certain of this now. The writer of the folders was something older and more distant, something I do not have any way to think about. The thing at the end of the aisle was a witness, like me. It was something that had been a person once, and had been added to the archive, and had stayed. I cannot tell you how I know this. I can tell you that what I felt when I felt it standing there was not the cold patience I associated with the writing on the pages, but something warmer, something that recognized me, something that wanted me to be careful. I have come to think, in the months since, that what I felt was Coralt. Not Coralt as he is now, in whatever motel or distant town he has fled to, but Coralt as he will be, at the end of his life, when his folder is closed and he is filed in the chamber, and he stands at the end of the aisle waiting for the next witness to come down the stairs. I think he was warning me. I think he was telling me what he had been telling himself for 25 years. The warning he had heard in his own voice when he was younger. The warning he was now passing forward to me, because that is what the witnesses do. That is what the chamber asks of them, that they stay and they wait and they warn the next one in a chain that has been going on for longer than the building, longer than the rail yard, longer than the quarry. I have wondered since, what will happen to me when my folder is closed? I have wondered whether I will stand at the end of the aisle and wait for the next night guard in whatever building rises on the site of the demolished mall, to come down a different set of stairs, and to sit at a different desk, and to open a different folder, and to feel a presence behind him that he cannot quite name. I have wondered whether the warning I will try to give him will be the warning I am giving you now, in a longer and stranger form. The warning that the world is bigger than we have been taught, that it has rooms underneath it that we cannot see, that everything we do is being noticed by something, and that the noticing is neither punishment nor reward, but only the patient work of an archive that has no end and no purpose we can understand, and that the only freedom we have, the only freedom that matters, is the freedom to close the folder before we have read it all the way through, and to go upstairs and to live the part of the life that has not yet been written down, even though it has been written down, even though we know it has, even though we cannot pretend we do not know. I have one more thing to tell you, and then I will try to bring this to its end. I went back to the diner where Coralt and I had met a few weeks ago. I do not know what I was hoping for. I sat at the same booth. I ordered the same coffee. I waited for a long time, though I could not have told you what I was waiting for. The waitress came by twice and asked if I was all right. I told her I was. After about an hour, she came by a third time, and she said, "Are you Adrien?" I said I was. She said, "The old man left this for you a while back. He said you would come in eventually. He said to give it to you when you did." She handed me an envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. On it, in Coral's hand, were 3 sentences. The first sentence said, "I am sorry I did not tell you sooner. I should have told you the first night." The second sentence said, "You will not see me again, but you will hear me at the end, and I want you to know that I will be telling you the truth, the way I am telling you now." The third sentence said, "When your folder is closed and you take your place at the end of the aisle, the next one will come down the stairs. And when he does, please tell him what I am telling you. Tell him that the chamber is not the worst thing. Tell him that what is written can also be read, and what is read can also be closed, and that the closing is a small mercy, and the mercy is real, and that the mercy is the only thing we have to give to the ones who come after us. Tell him not to read to the end. Tell him to stand up before he finishes. Tell him to climb the stairs. Tell him that you and I are waiting at the bottom, not to keep him there, but to make sure he leaves." I have kept the letter. I keep it folded in a drawer, beside a photograph of Iris that I have begun to be able to look at again. I do not look at the letter often. I do not need to. I have memorized it. I think about it on the days when I feel watched, on the days when I feel the cold patience of the chamber pressing up through the floor of whatever room I'm in, on the days when I'm tempted, in some half-articulated way, to go back to the site of the mall before the demolition crews arrive, to find the door, to descend the stairs, to open the folder and read the pages I did not read, to know everything before it happens. I do not go back. I think I will not go back. I cannot promise that. I can only promise that on most days, I close the drawer and I go to the window and I look at the street and I remind myself that the part of my life that is mine is the part I have not yet finished reading, and that the only way to keep it mine is to not finish reading it, and that this is a kind of work, and that the work is the work of being a person, and that the work does not end until the folder closes on its own. I have come to believe that this is what was being asked of me, all along. Not bravery, not understanding, not even refusal. Only the small daily act of choosing to leave the folder closed. Only the small daily act of not knowing when I could have known. Only the small daily act of getting up and getting dressed and walking out into a day that has been written down somewhere I cannot see, and pretending, with as much grace as I can manage, that it has not been written, that I am the one writing it, that the woman across from me in the coffee shop is a stranger I am only just meeting, that the small house with the yard is a hope and not a record, that the Sunday morning in October is something I am moving toward, and not something I have already lived in a chamber beneath a building that no longer exists. I do not know if I am succeeding. Some days I think I am. Some days I think the chamber is winning, that I'm only doing what was written, that even my refusal is a thing that was written, that the folder accounts for the refusal as carefully as it accounts for everything else. On those days, I sit very still, and I try to remember what I felt when I closed the folder and stood up and walked down the central aisle. I try to remember the moment of the choosing. I try to remember that the choosing was real, whatever the folder said. The closing was real, that the climbing of the stairs was real, that the locking of the door was real, that the giving of the keys to Marisol was real, that the not going back is real, every night, every morning, every day, that I do not drive to the site and find a way in. I have begun to think that this is what the chamber wanted from me. Not my surrender, and not my escape, but the long, slow work of choosing every day for the rest of my life to not finish reading. I have begun to think that this is what it wanted from Corald, and from the woman who wrote the entry in 1989, and from all the witnesses before them, going back to whatever the first of us was. I have begun to think that the archive is not interested in our deaths, or our griefs, or our small private failures, except as material. I have begun to think that what the archive is interested in is the choosing. I have begun to think that this is why the folder is set out on the desk, open to the first page, when the witness arrives. I have begun to think that this is why the brass key is left in a safe whose combination is given to us only when we are ready. I have begun to think that the chamber is not a trap. The chamber is a question. The question is asked of every one of us who finds our way down the stairs. The question is whether we will read to the end or whether we will close the folder. And the answer we give is the only thing we ever truly do. I want to tell you something else that I have been thinking about in the last few weeks, because I think it bears on what the chamber is for, and what we are for, and how the two are connected. I have been thinking about my mother, and the day she took me to the mall in 1989. I have been thinking about what she might have wished for when I threw the coin into the fountain. I have been thinking that she must have wished for something too. I have been thinking that the wishes a parent makes at the fountains of suburban malls are not the wishes a child makes. A child wishes for a sister, or a dog, or a daughter someday. A parent wishes for the small, invisible things that make a child's life possible. A parent wishes for the child to outlive them. A parent wishes for the child to be loved. A parent wishes for the child to find some small reason to keep getting up. The chamber would have recorded all of this. The chamber would have placed my mother's wish next to mine. The chamber would have known, before either of us, that my mother's wish was the more powerful, that her wish was the one that would shape the years that followed, that my wish for a daughter had only come true at all because my mother had wished harder that I would have a life worth wanting daughters in. I have begun to think that the folders are not records of what is going to happen exactly. I have begun to think they are records of the wishes that have been made, and the way those wishes weave together, and the way the weaving makes a kind of future that none of us individually chose, but which all of us together produced. I have thought about Renata too. Her folder was opened on the same day as mine, when she was in another state, who had never been to Westfield, and never would be. I do not know what wish she might have made on that day, but someone, somewhere, must have wished for her, the way my mother wished for me, and that wish must have placed her in the same column of the same ledger as mine, and the chamber must have known, in 1989, that we would meet and marry and have Iris and lose her and lose each other, and that all of this would happen because of wishes made by people who would never know they had made them, in fountains and on candles and in dark cars on long drives. I have come to think that the chamber is not a recorder of fate. I have come to think the chamber is a record of love, the kind of love that does not announce itself, The kind of love that does not even know it is love. The kind of love that one person silently wishes for another from across a fountain in a half-empty mall, and which the building somehow records and keeps and uses to organize the lives that will follow. I do not know if this is true. I cannot verify it. I cannot prove I told you. I can only tell you that this is what I have come to think in the months since I walked out of the chamber, and that the thinking has changed me, and that the change is not something I can undo, and that I'm not sure I would want to. I want to say something about Iris now, because I have not said enough, and because I do not think I will get another chance to say it. Iris was the kind of child who noticed things. She noticed the third tier of the fountain that wasn't there. She noticed when I had not slept. She noticed when her mother was sad. She noticed in the last year of her life that she was getting tired more easily. And she did not tell us because she did not want us to worry, and we did not notice that she had not told us because we were already worried about something else. And that is one of the things I have not forgiven myself for, and which I do not expect to forgive myself for in this life. The chamber knew all of this. The chamber's record of Iris would have been short in pages, but it would have been heavier than any of the other records, because everything Iris noticed got placed into her file with the small, careful weight of a child who paid attention. I think this is why I could not look at her folder. I think I was afraid that if I opened it, I would learn that she had noticed, in the year before she died, that something was wrong and had not told me. And the page would describe the moment she had decided not to. And I would have to live with the knowledge of that moment for the rest of my life. I am glad I did not open it. I will say that again, because it is the truest thing I have said in this account. I am glad I did not open it. The choosing not to open it was the only thing I did in that chamber that was wholly and only mine. And I will hold on to that, against the writing, against the arranging, against the cold, patient attention of whatever was watching me from the back of the room. I want to tell you, finally, about the dream. I have had it twice since I left the mall, and I expect to have it more times. And I'm not sure whether to be afraid of it or grateful for it. In the dream, I am back in the chamber. The lamp on the desk is on. The folder is open. I am sitting in the chair. The presence is behind me. I can feel it. But this time, when I look down at the folder, the pages are blank. Not blank as in empty, blank as in waiting. The pages have a faint quality of expectancy, the way a page does when someone has not decided what to write on it. I look up. The chamber is the same. The shelves are full. The folders are arranged in their secret arrangement, but the folder on the desk, the folder labeled with my name, the folder that has been there since 2014, the folder that knew everything about my life and most of what would come, that folder is blank. I sit in the dream, and I try to understand what this means. I have come up with several theories in waking life, and I do not know which is true. One theory is that the chamber has stopped writing for me because I closed the folder, and the closing was sufficient, and the rest is now mine to write. Another theory is that the writing simply happens at a level I am no longer permitted to see, and that the blankness of the pages in the dream is the chamber's small mercy, a way of letting me believe that my life is mine, when in fact it continues to be recorded in some other place I will not be allowed to find. A third theory is that the dream is not a dream. that the dream is the chamber visiting me, that the chamber, in some way I do not understand, is asking me what I want to write on the blank pages, and that whatever I tell it in the dream is what gets written. I have not yet tried to tell it anything. I do not yet trust myself to know what to say. I think I will keep having the dream. I think I will keep sitting in the chair, looking down at the blank pages, feeling the presence behind me. I think eventually I will write something on a page in the dream, and the page will fill itself in. And I will know whether the writing was mine, or whether the writing only used me to put down what it already wanted to put down. I am not in a hurry. The chamber is patient, and I have learned slowly to be patient too. I have learned that the things you write quickly are not always the things you would have chosen. I have learned that the things you do not write at all sometimes turn out to be the things you most wanted to say. I do not know how to end this. I do not think it can be ended in the usual way. The events I have described are not finished because they are still happening, and because I am still being read, and because the part of the story that takes place in the chamber is the part I have already left, and the part of the story that takes place above the chamber, in the small daily life I am now living, is the part that is still being written. I can tell you what I know now. I can tell you that the woman from the food court, whose name I have not yet given you because I'm not sure I am allowed to, asked me last week if I would meet her family at a small dinner she is hosting in the spring. I said yes. I have not yet decided what to bring. I have been thinking lately of bringing a bottle of wine and a small jar of malted milk eggs. I do not know why. I suspect the chamber knows why, in its way, but I do not yet, and I am content to be slower than it for as long as I am allowed. I can tell you that I drove past Westfield Mall once, in the second month after I left, because I needed to know that the building was still standing. It was. The parking lot was nearly empty. The doors at the south end were boarded up. There was a notice on one of them, in small print, about the demolition schedule. I sat in the car for a long time. I did not get out. I did not look for the door at the back of the freight elevator shaft. I drove away. I drove home. I sat at my kitchen table, and I drank a glass of water, and I wrote a letter to Iris, the first one in many months. I did not know where to send it. I did not need to. I put it in a drawer with the others. I keep them all. I will keep them all until the day described on the last page of my folder. The day I do not say aloud. The day that whatever Iris said about being there first and knowing how to find me will or will not turn out to be true. I cannot know in advance whether she was right. I have decided to behave as if she was. This is the only thing I have learned from the chamber and from the years since that I think I can pass on without ruining anyone. Behave as if the people who loved you were right about you. Behave as if the wishes that have been made for you by people you will never know about are still being made. Behave as if the future is being written by something patient and not by something cruel. Behave as if your folder is on a desk somewhere and someone is reading it carefully. And what they want, more than anything, is to find out whether you were the kind of person who closed the folder and stood up and climbed the stairs. That is the end of what I can tell you. I am sorry it is not more dramatic than this. I am sorry there is no monster, and no chase, and no escape that requires courage of the kind people enjoy reading about. I am sorry that the horror, in the end, was only a room, and a desk, and a folder, and a choice. I am sorry also that I do not have a better ending to give you, because the ending has not yet happened, and when it does, I will not be the one telling it. Someone else will descend a different set of stairs in a different building, and will sit at a different desk, and will read about himself, and will close the folder, or not, and will climb the stairs, or not, and will live the rest of his life, or not, in the small daily work of not knowing, and that someone might be you. And if it is, I hope you remember what I told you, and I hope you close the folder, and I hope you climb the stairs, and I hope you find us waiting at the bottom. And I hope you let us do for you what Coral did for me, which was to make sure, with whatever small remaining mercy he had to give, that I left. My name is Adrien Vasko. I worked the overnight shift at Westfield Mall for 9 years. The mall is scheduled for demolition next spring. I will not be there when it comes down. I will be somewhere else, in a small apartment that will become, by then, a small house with a yard. I will be eating breakfast, perhaps, or reading the paper, or sitting across from a woman. I am pretending I have only just met. I will be alive in the part of the day that is mine, which is the part I have not yet read. The chamber will be beneath whatever new building rises on the site, holding its folders, arranging its names, opening its files on children who throw coins into fountains that have not yet been built. Somewhere in the chain of witnesses at the back of the aisle, Corot will be standing, waiting, and after a while, I will be standing beside him, and after a longer while, someone else will be standing beside me, and the three of us waiting for the next one to come down the stairs. And when he does, we will do for him what was done for us, which is the only thing any of us can do for each other, in a world that is being read while we live in it, by something we will never see, for reasons we will never know. We will make sure he leaves.